Fasten your seatbelts, friends. It's going to be a bumpy night. I can't tell you exactly what I was feeling the first time I heard those immortal words from Betty Davis, but man, they seem dangerous. In the middle of a party in the 1950 film All About Eve, Margot Channing, the sort of anti-hero of the movie, played by the immortal Betty Davis, downs a martini, ascends a small set of stairs to a low landing, turns to the camera or the audience, meant to be the partygoers, and snaps that whipple of a line, foreshadowing, maybe foretelling is a better word, how the rest of that scene would go. Well, it ended with her head on the pianist requesting him to play Liebestrom over and over. We've all been there. And that same scene introduced Marilyn Monroe to the world as an up-and-coming megastar. It also had Celeste Holm at the peak of her reserved, calm, and always deftly dealt deck of acting powers. And let us never forget Anne Baxter's turn in the same scene as Eve Harrington. As our mostly reliable narrator for the movie tells us, after all, we're going to hear more about Eve. In fact, we're going to hear all about Eve. If nothing I've been talking about so far makes sense to you, I apologize. See, I grew up performing in theatrical productions of one kind or another nonstop from 5th grade all the way through college. And you cannot escape quotes from this movie, All About Eve, in that world. It's basically a battle of divas set against the backdrop of the Broadway stage at the time that Hollywood was becoming the big draw for famous and upcoming actors. And as much as I love the movie, some parts of it today are a little hard to watch. And I don't want to get into how or why too much because much of the plot turns on some of those reasons it's hard to watch. And if you haven't seen it, you probably should. But the thing I think is most refreshing in it, and what ages in it I think the best still, is that the women drive the plot of the movie. Right, it's a revolution, friends. They make all their own decisions. And in fact, virtually all of the main storylines revolve around their relationships to one another. The men in the movie actually are more like set pieces. They're the ones that sort of pipe up with little speeches here and there and then shut up again, which is the way it should be. All except for Addison DeWitt, played by George Sanders, but that's for a whole different sermon about criticism. So fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night. The title of the movie is clearly an allusion to the character from the Hebrew scriptures named Eve. In most contemporary translations of the Hebrew scriptures, that is that person's name. It's the name we use widely today, Eve, but it comes from the Hebrew word in Genesis, Chava. This word has a range of meanings, derivatives, and translations. Indeed, as any linguist will tell you, anyone who studies ancient languages will also tell you that any translation is commentary. It is also a type of interpretation. So how we translate something or derive its meaning needs to be done with great care. A preeminent scholar of Hebrew scripture, Carol Myers, shares that there's little debate really about the meaning of Chava. The text itself in Genesis says that Eve became the mother of all life. Chava in Hebrew means to live or to give life, depending on the context. And the scriptures also share that Eve named all of the first human life. So many scholars also agree that this was meant to show the authority that Chava had over all life. And finally, the third factor that is very important is the first feeding and nurturing of human life, which is meant to do much the same. And this way, these three ways of understanding Chava in the opening of the Hebrew scriptures of the life-giving authority, really, that much of the world has inherited from culture, from literature, and from life itself, was ravaged this week. Many of us saw with utter horror, a facility in Ukraine that cares for mothers and their newborn children becoming the target of a missile attack by Russia. And horrifyingly, news of the attack came when much of the world was celebrating International Women's Day on March 8th. The confluence of these events rings for some as galling or perhaps tragic, and they are, but the roots of International Women's Day go very, very deep. These roots form a foundation for massive changes to the world over the past 2 centuries. International Women's Day started with the organization and then the strike of garment workers in New York City in 1908. Like notable strikes that would follow this one, it did not last for a day, it did not last for a week or even a month. It lasted for more than a year. The demonstrations, the changes that they needed to see coming. The garment workers of New York who suffered these horrible working conditions and lacked a voice in the governance of the purportedly democratic nation where they lived and worked yet could not vote, organized these protests and strikes in the streets of New York for that year or more. And then the Organization for Voting Rights and Better Conditions to International Women's Day spread to parts of Europe in 1910, and the movement kept growing and taking on even more reach. And even today, rather than being some kind of fond remembrance of long ago struggles, in Pakistan even today, women spend the day marching in the street to remind people of the unequal treatment in their society. And that's just one example. And the vastly higher incidence of violence against women across the globe. The hope in Pakistan and in other places is in those nations is to demonstrate on this day and to show the world how long we really have to go globally to reach something approaching justice or equality. In an article published on this March 8th, journalism intern, way to go, Zoya Vazir, published her second piece for the US News and World Report, and it was about the radical roots of International Women's Day. In the piece, she explains that it was on March 8th, 1917, on the Russian calendar, February 23 for others, when Russian women held a demonstration across Russia for International Women's Day. And the organization, the scope of that protest led to more and more protests and more groups in the streets until the Russian Revolution took place in 1917, right from this radical root. And the abdication of the Tsar took place less than a week following International Women's Day demonstrations in Russia. See, when people in power get nervous about women organizing, they're not being irrational. In fact, structures of power have been trying to prevent that kind of organizing for millennia. Because those structures know how powerful that organization can be. Yeah, they better fasten their seatbelts because it's going to be a bumpy night. In the last few weeks, more than 2 million people are on the move from Ukraine to nations around the world as refugees fleeing their homes. I recently heard from our friend, the Reverend Elhud Szabo from the Hungarian Unitarian Church, that their organization is collecting funds to support refugees on the move out of Ukraine. Also, Elhud let us know that that families of his church and throughout his region in the Unitarian Church are also preparing their very homes to welcome people in for an undetermined amount of time. And this situation is not going to get better very soon, I'm afraid. It's a problem that will be in the world for a long time to come. Now, this wouldn't be a Unitarian Universalist sermon if we didn't also talk about ways to address these problems that we're seeing in the world, if we didn't look for solutions. I'm guessing watching hours of live coverage streaming into your eyeballs, or perhaps the placid reporting on radio stations, isn't really solving anything for you. It's not for me. It's actually sort of infuriating, to be perfectly honest. I personally find it painful to hear newscasters or any other human beings analyze, discuss, apply reason or anything other than bald, unadorned shock and horror at what one nation is doing to another. I sort of find it unsettling to hear people so calm about it. And then I feel some shame or responsibility in my response, like, isn't it my job to bear witness to what's happening? Shouldn't I be watching this? Shouldn't I be seeing this? Shouldn't I be holding the human suffering of others in ways that might be helpful? Trust me, friends, I wish there was a simple answer for you, but we just really have pieces to start with. First, your Social Justice Council has already met and are planning to have our April Share the Plate support the Hungarian Church's efforts as it becomes more clear what it is they will be doing. And in the meantime, we will be hearing more from Elhud about how to directly help in ways that our sibling churches also organize and discover to do. And these are ways that will help the direct experience of those suffering and ways we might help to give life to those whose lives are threatened. And these are not the only people we need to think about in these times. Please also consider what you need to be doing for yourself in these times. In this month, we are looking at balance as the theme. And it is a good impulse to worry about the lives of others and to seek a cure for them, to seek care for them. And what is the first rule of rescuing or helping somebody else? You've got to take care of yourself first. Some of you know me and you know some of my preaching, and my temptation here is to just list a lot of ways we should run out and start doing things and do this and do that. And there are going to be times to do that, but these times, my friends, are perilous. You might not believe it, but anxiety in the lives of those in churches and in other parts of our country around the world is higher now than it was at any part during the pandemic. Part of that comes with what many of us are doing in this moment of being together in spaces like this, for some of us for the first time. And so paying attention to the ways that anxiety is creeping into our lives is important. I would hope for each of us that we are doing the life-giving, life-affirming things that our time and our attention call us to do. Or at least that for as long as we pay attention to the news, we are also paying attention to the things that help to calm, to soothe, and to nurture us. We can find balance, friends. For me, it's a walk across my street to the baseball game at UH lately. If you're looking for me on the weekends, that's where I am. It's a second time through all the seasons of the Great British Baking Show. It's just what I've got, friends. It's Swedish police procedurals, dramas set against bleak landscapes with unfathomably bleaker characters. It's walks in nature or calling friends. Whatever it is, please try to balance this anxiety you are feeling with things that give you life. And there is something we've almost 100 chances to do today. It's something I've not really pushed on this congregation in the past few years for reasons that will become abundantly clear, in part because so many of us are busy, in part because it's hard to do online, but I wouldn't be your minister if I did not start to speak my heart. If you are wondering when the time to start a practice of radical welcome is in the life of this church, when do you think that is? Yes. Oh, yesterday. All right. 3 years ago, did you say? What? That's right. It's now. And that looks different for all of us. But friends, our kin are on the move. People are crossing borders, physical, emotional, spiritual borders to save their very lives. And we will and we must do what we can to have their backs, to help them to survive some of the most horrific experiences the modern world has seen, and helping them not only to survive, but to thrive, to grow in a way that reality is nothing short of beautiful. And we will do this. We must do this. But we must also remember, people are crossing borders, physical, emotional, spiritual borders, to save their lives by coming here, by tuning in here. And we will and we must do what we can to have their backs too, to help them to survive whatever they are going through in their lives of the highest anxiety many of us have ever known. This helping those with us right here, not only to survive, but to thrive and to grow in a new place, a new ohana, one they have many long time longed to know, like so many of us have experienced. That is truly beautiful too. And we will do this. We must do this. But here's the thing. Radical welcome, stopping whatever we are doing to celebrate the arrival of any one of us, is not something we only do for someone else. It is a way of practicing self-love, of self-care, of self-respect. It is in this way that we break down borders, physical, emotional, and spiritual borders, to save our very lives, to help us survive whatever we are going through in our lives. To do this, to love yourself in this way, beautiful isn't the word, exquisite. And it is in our very DNA. Whether we like it or not, Chava, the giver of all life, the bringer of joy, in Toni Morrison's words, says this to the ages, to all of us: I would do it all over again. Be the harbor and set the sail. Loose the breeze and harness the gale. Cherish the harvest of what I have been. Better the summit to scale, better the summit to be. And isn't that the real knowledge that Chava, that Eve found? The bringer, the namer, the giver of all life, of all joy, is the knowledge that each one of us is both a harbor that welcomes, holds, and protects, and is a sail that can chase the wind to the corners of the earth where people are longing to be free, that each one of us can loose the breeze of kindness ourselves with a word or a gesture or a glance, and we can harness the breeze that moves a vessel through the world to the corners of the earth where people are yearning to be free, that each one of us must cherish the harvest of what we have been. We must realize the value we hold in ourselves and others. Our very lives are harvests that can feed, that can nourish, that can welcome all. It is by this that we find the summits to scale, the ways we must explore and see new ways of being together. It is by this that we search for those in need and offer a place to belong, a place that welcomes all, a place to be at peace at last, a summit of peace. And it is by this that we at last arrive, knowing our own worth, proving our own welcome, finally sensing with clear vision from the summit that each one of us is. That is where you are inviting people with radical welcome. That is where a primordial sense of self-love holds us in our hand, as ripe as the first sweet fruit of history that Eve held. That is what gives life. That is what gives protection. That is what gives joy. Fasten your seatbelts, friends. No matter what lessons you think you've learned, That is what love is all about. That is what welcome is all about. That is what Eve is all about. And it is beautiful.